In the spring of 1453, the sun rose over an empire that had dwindled to little more than a single set of stone walls. For more than 11 centuries, Constantinople had stood as the heart of Eastern Christendom and the unbroken continuation of the Roman Empire. Founded by Constantine the Great in the year 330, the city had once commanded the trade routes of the known world, its population topping 500,000 souls, its palaces clad in marble and gold. By the middle of the 15th century, that grandeur was a ghost. Decades of civil war, economic decay, and the devastating sack by Western Crusaders during the Fourth Crusade in 1204 had carved the imperial capital into a hollow shell. Fields, orchards, and abandoned ruins separated isolated neighborhoods within its vast perimeter. Its population had collapsed to barely 50,000. Yet, surrounding this fragile remnant stood the greatest defensive system of the pre-modern world, the triple-layered Theodosian walls. Built in the 5th century, featuring deep moats, massive ramparts, and 96 immense towers, these fortifications had repelled Slavs, Persians, Avars, Bulgars, and Arabs over 1,000 years of siege warfare. They were widely considered unbreachable. To the west lay the expanding realm of the Ottoman Turks, a dynamic young power that had spent 2 centuries absorbing Byzantine territories in Europe and Asia Minor. By 1451, Constantinople was completely surrounded, an isolated imperial island in an Ottoman sea. That year, a new ruler ascended the Ottoman throne, Sultan Mehmed II. Mehmed was just 19 years old when he assumed power for the second time, after a brief and troubled initial reign as a child. Coldly analytical, highly educated, and fluent in multiple languages, the young sultan was driven by an consuming geopolitical objective, the capture of Constantinople. For centuries, Islamic tradition had spoken of the conquest of the great Christian city as a supreme destiny, and Mehmed recognized that holding Constantinople was the essential key to bridging his empire's European and Asian domains. In 1452, Mehmed began his preparations. Just north of the city, at the narrowest point of the Bosporus Strait, he constructed a massive fortress within 4 months, Rumela Hisari, the throat cutter. Armed with long-range cannon, it effectively severed Constantinople's connection to the Black Sea, starving the city of vital grain shipments and potential reinforcements from Genoese colonies in the north. Inside Constantinople, the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, recognized the gathering storm. Constantine was 50 years old, a capable administrator and courageous soldier who had inherited a bankrupt state and a splintered people. For centuries, the religious schism between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church had divided Christendom. Desperate for Western military aid, Constantine agreed to formal religious union with Rome, a decision that bitterly alienated much of his own populace, who remembered the horrors of the 1204 Latin occupation. The promised help from Western Europe arrived only as a trickle. A few Italian city-states recognized the existential threat to their trade networks. The Republic of Venice sent war galleys and sailors, while a brilliant Genoese soldier of fortune, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, arrived with 700 heavily armored professional mercenaries. Giustiniani was an expert in defensive warfare, and Emperor Constantine immediately placed him in supreme command of the land walls. Together, the defenders assembled their forces. The numbers were harrowing. Against an Ottoman army estimated between 80,000 and 100,000 men, including thousands of elite janissaries, the Sultan's professional infantry, the defenders could muster barely 7,000 to 8,000 armed men. To cover nearly 14 miles of land and sea walls, Constantine's soldiers were spaced out with agonizing thinness. Every defender knew that if a breach was made, there were no reserves to plug the gap. In April 1453, the Ottoman host arrived before the city walls. Mehmed set up his imperial red and gold tent opposite the gate of St. Romanus, along the central section of the land walls known as the Mesotichion. Here, the terrain dipped into the Lycus River Valley, making the fortifications structurally weaker and vulnerable to siege operations. To break the ancient stone, Mehmed brought a new weapon into the arena of total war: super-heavy gunpowder artillery. A Hungarian cannon founder named Urban had initially offered his services to the Byzantines, but the impoverished imperial treasury could neither afford his fees nor secure the raw materials he required. Urban then traveled to the court of Mehmed II, promising to cast a weapon capable of shattering the walls of Babylon itself. Mehmed provided unlimited resources. In the foundries of Adrianople, Urban cast a monster, a massive bronze bombard known as the basilic. Over 26 feet long, with barrel walls 8 inches thick, the supercannon was capable of launching granite balls weighing up to 1,200 pounds over a distance of a mile. It took 60 oxen and hundreds of men weeks to haul the Titan to the front line. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman bombardment began. The noise was apocalyptic. The shockwaves resonated through the ancient masonry and shook the earth for miles around. For the first time in history, gunpowder artillery was deployed on a massive scale against classic late antique fortifications. Yet, the giant bombards had severe limitations. They took hours to cool, clear, and reload, and could fire only a handful of times each day. The massive thermal stress frequently cracked the bronze barrels. During these long operational delays, the defenders performed miracles of engineering. Led by Giustiniani, night after night, the citizens of Constantinople, men, women, monks, and children, labored under the dark sky to repair the damage. They filled timber frameworks with earth, rubble, and stone. Surprisingly, this loose, shock-absorbing earthen palisade proved better at absorbing the kinetic force of incoming stone cannonballs than the rigid, ancient masonry walls. Mehmed's plan was not limited to a frontal ground assault. To fully invest the city, he had to secure the Golden Horn, the deep natural harbor along the city's northern flank. However, the Byzantines had blocked the harbor mouth with a massive boom chain forged of iron links, supported by heavy wooden floats and protected by armed Venetian and Genoese ships. Multiple Ottoman naval attempts to force or cut the chain were repulsed with heavy losses by the superior seamanship of the defenders and their use of Greek fire, the ancient Byzantine incendiary weapon. Stymied at sea, Mehmed executed one of the most remarkable logistical maneuvers in military history. If his fleet could not breach the chain, he would go around it. On the night of April 21, under cover of darkness and hidden behind a ridge east of the Genoese colony of Galata, Ottoman engineers constructed a road of greased wooden logs stretching over 3 miles of steep, hilly terrain. The following morning, the horrified defenders looked across the Golden Horn to see Ottoman war galleys being hauled overland by teams of oxen and hundreds of soldiers, descending smoothly into the harbor behind the defensive chain. By placing nearly 70 war vessels into the Golden Horn, Mehmed changed the strategic equation. The defenders were forced to reallocate precious men and artillery to man the sea walls along the harbor, stretching Constantine's depleted garrison past the breaking point. A midnight attempt by Italian sailors to firebomb the landed Ottoman fleet was betrayed by double agents and ended in catastrophic failure, with captured sailors executed in sight of the city walls. As April turned to May, the siege became a bloody war of attrition. Ottoman forces launched repeated infantry assaults against the earthen palisades of the Lycus Valley, but each wave was repulsed by the disciplined crossfire of Giustiniani's men and the imperial forces. Mehmed ordered his Serbian mining engineers to dig deep subterranean tunnels beneath the Theodosian walls to collapse the foundations. The defenders countered by employing a Scottish engineer named John Grant, who used water-filled drums to locate the vibrations of the Ottoman tunnels. Grant's counterminers dug down to meet the attackers underground, smoke bombing, flooding, or collapsing the tunnels in brutal hand-to-hand fights beneath the earth. Despite these defensive triumphs, the physical and psychological strain on Constantinople was overwhelming. Food reserves were exhausted. Fog routinely hung low over the Hagia Sophia, and strange atmospheric lights were reported swirling around the Golden Dome, interpreted by the terrified populace as the divine glory of God abandoning the city. An ancient prophecy had long whispered that Constantinople would fall when the moon was in eclipse. On May 22, a partial lunar eclipse darkened the night sky. By late May, Mehmed knew his own army was growing restive. The siege was expensive, and rumors circulated that a Hungarian force or a Venetian fleet was sailing to relieve the city. On May 26, Mehmed held a council of war. His Grand Vizier, Halil Pasha, who had long favored a peaceful settlement and feared Western military intervention, urged the Sultan to raise the siege.
But Mehmed's young war council, led by dynamic commanders, demanded a final, decisive assault.
Mehmed issued his terms: hand over the city, and its inhabitants would be spared; refuse, and the law of Islamic conquest would apply. 3 days of plundering for his soldiers. Constantine XI rejected the demand to surrender the city, writing to the Sultan, "To surrender the city to you is beyond my authority or anyone else's who lives in it, for all of us, with one accord, have decided to die of our own free will, without sparing our lives." On the evening of May 28, a eerie calm settled over the Ottoman camps. Mehmed ordered massive bonfires lit, illuminating the besieging army, and proclaimed a day of rest and prayer before the ultimate attack. Inside the city, the divisions that had torn Christian society apart evaporated in the face of annihilation. For the final time, Orthodox priests, Latin monks, imperial nobles, Italian sailors, and ordinary citizens gathered inside the vast, vaulted interior of the Hagia Sophia. Together, they sang hymns and shared Holy Communion in a final, heartbreaking act of unity. Emperor Constantine XI walked through the historic basilica, asked his subjects for forgiveness if he had ever wronged them, and rode out into the night toward his post on the land walls. At 1:30 on the morning of May 29, 1453, the final assault commenced. Mehmed threw his troops forward in coordinated waves along the Lycus Valley. The first wave consisted of tens of thousands of irregular auxiliaries, the Bashi-bazouks, conscripts, mercenaries, and adventurers from across the empire. Their purpose was to exhaust the defenders and drain their ammunition. For 2 hours, Giustiniani's men stood fast atop the earthen ramparts, cutting down the attackers in the darkness. As the first wave recoiled, Mehmed unleashed his second wave, heavily armored Anatolian infantry. Armed with scimitars, maces, and battle axes, they surged against the shattered palisades. The combat was brutal, hand-to-hand, and unceasing. Still, the exhausted defenders held the line, throwing back the Ottoman flags that were repeatedly planted on the earthworks. With dawn approaching, Mehmed committed his ultimate reserve, his elite janissaries. Fresh, impeccably disciplined, and moving to the thunderous rhythm of kettle drums and trumpets, thousands of janissaries advanced at a swift, steady double march. At this decisive moment, double disaster struck the defense. In a secluded sector of the northern land walls near Blacherny, Ottoman troops discovered a small postern gate, the Kirka Porta, which had been used for night sorties and left unlocked or compromised in the chaos. A group of janissaries forced their way inside, climbed to the top of the inner wall, and raised the Ottoman banner. The sight sparked immediate panic among the nearby defenders, who shouted that the city had fallen. Simultaneously, in the critical Lycus Valley sector, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo was struck in the chest by iron shrapnel or a crossbow bolt that pierced his armor. Bleeding profusely and in agonizing pain, the Genoese commander insisted on being removed from the battlefield to a ship in the harbor. Seeing their charismatic leader carried away through the inner gate, the Italian mercenaries panicked. They broke formation and retreated into the city, believing the battle was lost. The defensive line collapsed. Left virtually alone with a handful of imperial guards, Emperor Constantine XI saw the janissaries pouring through the broken wall. Tearing off his imperial purple mantle and badges of rank to blend into the common foot soldiers, Constantine drew his sword and led a desperate countercharge into the surging tide of redcoats and steel. He was last seen alive fighting fiercely at the St. Romanus Gate. His body was never definitively identified. By sunrise, the Ottoman forces were streaming into the city through multiple broken gates. Thousands of citizens fled toward the massive double doors of the Hagia Sophia, seeking divine sanctuary and locking the massive bronze entrance behind them. Ottoman soldiers soon reached the ancient basilica, forced open the doors, and halted in awe at the sheer scale of the interior. Mehmed too entered Constantinople later that afternoon through the gate of St. Romanus, flanked by his guards and viziers. He rode his horse slowly down the processional way toward the Hagia Sophia. Entering the grand structure, he brushed away a soldier who was attempting to hack at the marble floor tiles, reminding his men that while plunder was their right, the buildings belonged to the Sultan. Mehmed dismounted, scooped up a handful of earth, and placed it on his turban in an act of humility, before ordering that the church immediately be cleansed and converted into a mosque.
He then recited the Muslim declaration of faith. At 21 years of age, Mehmed had achieved what centuries of caliphs and sultans could not.
He claimed the city as his new imperial capital, taking the title Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, viewing himself as the direct successor to the ancient Roman emperors.
The news of the fall of Constantinople struck Western Christendom like a thunderbolt.
The psychological blow was profound. The ancient Christian shield against Eastern expansion had vanished overnight. Popes issued desperate calls for new crusades, but European monarchs, locked in their own national rivalries, failed to respond. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is widely regarded by historians as a primary turning point that closed the Middle Ages and ushered in the early modern era. The closure of traditional overland trade routes between Europe and Asia under Ottoman control forced European merchant empires to turn their eyes west and south, accelerating the Portuguese and Spanish maritime voyages of discovery that eventually reached India and the Americas. Furthermore, in the months before and after the city's fall, a massive diaspora of Greek scholars, philosophers, texts, and classical manuscripts flooded into the Italian peninsula. This influx of ancient knowledge gave vital momentum to the intellectual fire already burning in the West, fueling the movement known as the European Renaissance. On the shores of the Bosporus, the city's name eventually evolved from Constantinople to Istanbul. The vast Theodosian walls, battered by Urban's bronze cannon and scarred by hand-to-hand combat, remain standing as silent witnesses to the day an ancient world finally perished, and a modern world was born.